What happens when a CEO publicly divorces his wife at their own company gala? Calling her a rough draft in front of hundreds of people, Marcus Thornton thought he was upgrading his life, dumping his boring wife for an Instagram model, trading his past for a shinier future. He had no idea that the woman he humiliated came from one of the wealthiest families in Montana, or that her brother was about to destroy everything Marcus had built. Hit that like button if you're ready for the ultimate revenge story. Comment karma if you think he deserved it. Subscribe because you won't believe how this ends. Let's dive in. 24 hours ago, Carolyn Brennan was Mrs. Marcus Thornton, wife of Seattle's most celebrated tech CEO. Now she stood alone in the sterile hallway of Swedish Medical Center, hands trembling as she clutched an ultrasound photo. 8 weeks pregnant, the black and white image showed a tiny flutter of life that Marcus Thornton knew nothing about. And he never would, if she had her way. Carrie pressed her forehead against the cool hospital wall, trying to steady her breathing. The past month had been a nightmare. No, nightmare was too gentle a word. It had been a public execution, broadcasted to 500 people and live-streamed to thousands more. She could still hear his voice echoing through the Innovate Seattle gala. Sometimes you outgrow your first draft. That's what Marcus had called her. His first draft? Like she was a rough outline he'd scribbled on a napkin during his struggling startup days. Something to be revised and improved upon. Never mind that she'd given him $50,000 from her grandmother's estate when his company was just 3 guys in a garage. Never mind that she'd supported him through 70-hour work weeks and a failed Series A round that nearly destroyed him. She was the first draft. Vivienne Cross, the Instagram influencer with 500,000 followers and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars, was apparently the final version. Carrie's phone buzzed. Grace Mitchell, her best friend since nursing school. "Where are you? I've been calling for an hour." "Hospital," Carrie said quietly. "I'm okay. Just needed to confirm something." "Confirm what, Carrie? You're scaring me." "I'm pregnant." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Carrie thought the call had dropped. "Grace, you there?" "I'm here. I'm just processing." "Does he know?" "No. And I don't know if I'm going to tell him." "Carrie, he's the father. He has a right. He gave up his rights when he announced our divorce on stage like it was a product launch." Carrie's voice cracked. "He had Vivian kiss him in front of everyone. He called me his rough draft." "Grace? So no, I don't think he has any rights to this baby." Grace sighed. "Where are you really?" "I'm at the hospital for the ultrasound. But tomorrow I'm flying home to Montana to see your family, to see Danny. I need my brother." That night, Carrie packed a small suitcase in the cramped one-bedroom apartment she'd moved into after leaving the penthouse. Marcus had kept everything. Of course, the art collection they'd built together, the furniture she'd chosen, even the stupid espresso machine she'd bought him for their 10th anniversary. His lawyers had offered her $2 million in the settlement. It sounded like a fortune to most people. But Carrie knew the truth. Apex Innovations, the company Marcus had built, was valued at over $2 billion. She'd been there from day one, had given him her inheritance, had been his sounding board for every major decision. $2 million was an insult wrapped in legal paper. But she'd signed it anyway. She just wanted it over. As she folded clothes into her suitcase, her phone lit up with notifications. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. The hashtag first draft was still trending 3 weeks later. Some people were on her side, calling Marcus cruel and heartless. Others said she was boring, that Marcus had simply upgraded to someone more appropriate for his status. The comments that hurt most were the ones that pitied her. Poor plain Caroline, she never stood a chance once he got rich. Carrie turned off her phone and finished packing. The next morning, her flight to Montana left at 6. She watched the Seattle skyline disappear beneath the clouds and felt nothing. No sadness, no anger, just a hollow emptiness where her marriage used to be. What she didn't know was that in a high-rise office building in downtown Seattle, Marcus Thornton was about to get his first taste of trouble. His chief financial officer, a nervous man named Preston Wells, was staring at stock reports with growing alarm. Someone was buying up Apex Innovations shares. Not dramatically, not obviously, but steadily, methodically, through shell corporations and private equity funds that Preston couldn't trace. "Marcus, we need to talk," Preston said. Walking into the CEO's office where Marcus sat with Vivian, planning their upcoming cover shoot for Tech Innovator magazine. Not now, Preston. We're busy. This can't wait. Someone's acquiring our stock. A lot of it. Marcus barely looked up. Market speculators. Happens all the time. We're hot right now. I don't think so. This is coordinated, sophisticated, and I can't figure out who's behind it. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. Then hire someone who can. I have more important things to worry about. Preston left, unconvinced. But Marcus was already distracted, showing Vivian the mock-up for their magazine spread. Tech's hottest power couple. The headline read, he had no idea his empire was already crumbling beneath him. The Innovate Seattle Gala had been Marcus Thornton's masterpiece of cruelty, and he'd planned every detail with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to hostile acquisitions. Carrie remembered arriving that night in a navy dress. Simple and elegant, she'd known something was coming. For weeks, Marcus had been distant, cold, but she thought maybe it was stress from the upcoming product launch. She'd convinced herself they could work through it. How naive she'd been. The Four Seasons ballroom had been packed with 500 guests, tech executives, venture capitalists, journalists from the Wall Street Journal and TechCrunch. Marcus had spared no expense. Ice sculptures, a 12-piece orchestra, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. Carrie had walked in alone. Marcus was already there. Vivian Cross glued to his side like a barnacle on a yacht. Vivian wore a silver dress that plunged nearly to her navel, and her laugh carried across the ballroom like breaking glass. Grace had been Carrie's +1, and she'd gripped Carrie's arm the moment she saw them together. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," Grace whispered. "I don't know what it is." Carrie had replied, but her stomach was already twisting into knots. Then Marcus took the stage. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for celebrating Apex Innovations with us tonight." Applause rippled through the crowd. Marcus had that effect on people. He was magnetic, charismatic, with the kind of confidence that made you believe he could sell ice to Alaska and make a profit. "Tonight, I want to talk about growth, about evolution, about having the courage to shed what no longer serves you." Carrie's blood had turned to ice. "In business, we call it pivoting. In life, I call it honesty. Carrie and I are getting divorced." The ballroom had gone silent. 500 people holding their collective breath. "Sometimes you outgrow your first draft," Marcus continued, and Carrie felt every eye in the room turn toward her. "You realize that the person who was right for the garage startup days isn't right for where you're headed, and that's okay. It's honest." Vivian had chosen that moment to kiss him. On stage, in front of everyone. The cameras flashed. The journalists started typing frantically on their phones, and Carrie had felt something inside her crack, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She'd walked to the bar, picked up a glass of red wine, and carried it to the edge of the stage. "Congratulations, Marcus," she'd said, her voice carrying in the shocked silence. "I hope your second draft realizes you don't honor contracts." Then she'd walked out. The video went viral within hours. First draft trended worldwide. Some people called Marcus a monster. Others said Carrie's response was legendary, but most just felt sorry for her, and that was somehow worse than anything else. Now, 3 weeks later, the dust had settled into a new reality. Marcus and Vivian were everywhere. Magazine covers, podcast interviews, Instagram stories showing their glamorous life. Vivian had moved into the penthouse immediately, redecorating Carrie's home with white furniture and modern art that looked like paint spilled by accident. Marcus seemed happy, triumphant, even. He gave interviews about authenticity in relationships and having the courage to choose happiness. He became a thought leader on living your truth, which apparently included publicly humiliating your wife of 12 years. Meanwhile, Carrie was in Montana. Her family's ranch was outside Bozeman, 3 hours from anywhere important. She'd grown up here, riding horses and reading books under ancient cottonwood trees. Marcus had visited exactly twice during their marriage, both times complaining about the lack of decent coffee and reliable Wi-Fi. "Your family's nice," he had said after the first visit, "but God, they're boring. Your dad talks about books nobody's read, And your brother looks like he's never left the property. Carrie had defended them, of course, but a small part of her had been embarrassed. Her family wasn't flashy or impressive by Seattle tech standards. Her father was a retired history teacher. Her mother did community theater. Her brother Danny ran the ranch and seemed perfectly content never to leave Montana. They were good people, but they weren't Marcus's people. The plane landed in Bozeman at noon. Danny was waiting at the airport, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, his hair too long and his boots dusty from morning work. He hugged her without saying anything, and Carrie finally let herself cry. "I've got you, little sister," Danny said. "Let's go home." The Brennan Ranch sprawled across 10,000 acres of Montana grassland and forest, but you wouldn't know it from the entrance. The driveway was gravel, lined with split-rail fences that needed paint. The main house was a craftsman-style home built in 1920, comfortable but not ostentatious. Marcus had called it charmingly rustic the first time he visited, which was his way of saying disappointingly poor. Carrie had never corrected his assumptions about her family's finances. It seemed easier to let him believe her grandmother's $50,000 gift was a significant chunk of the estate, rather than what it actually was. Pocket change from a timber fortune worth hundreds of millions. The Brennan family had been in Montana since 1873. They'd made their money in timber, then diversified into railroads, then mining, then quietly into stocks and bonds and private equity. But they didn't advertise it. Robert Brennan, Carrie's father, had learned from his own father that the best wealth was invisible wealth. The moment people know you have money, they start treating you differently. Robert had told his children, "They want something from you. They're not honest anymore. So we live quietly, and we're careful about who we trust." Carrie had trusted Marcus. She'd believed he loved her for who she was, not what she could give him. In hindsight, that seemed laughably naive. Danny pulled the truck up to the house, where their mother Helen was waiting on the porch. She was 65 but looked 10 years younger. With silver hair she wore in a braid and the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving Montana winters and raising two headstrong children. "Caroline," Helen said, pulling her into a hug, "you're home." That evening, the family gathered in the kitchen. Robert made his famous chili, and they ate at the worn oak table where Carrie had done her homework as a child. It felt surreal to be here, in this safe, familiar place, while her life in Seattle burned to the ground. "So," Danny said, pushing his empty bowl away, "tell us everything." Carrie did. She told him about the gala, about the divorce papers, about the $2 million settlement that Marcus's lawyers had presented as generous. She told him about Vivian moving into the penthouse, about the magazine covers and podcast interviews where Marcus talked about personal growth and authentic living. And then she told him about the pregnancy. Robert set down his coffee mug carefully. "Does Marcus know?" "No, and I don't know if I'm going to tell him." "He's the father," Robert said. "He should know. He gave up that right when he called me a first draft in front of 500 people," Carrie said, and she was surprised by the anger in her own voice. "He doesn't get to humiliate me publicly and then claim parental rights." Well, Danny had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now he leaned forward. "What do you want, Carrie? Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want?" It was a question nobody else had asked. Grace had immediately jumped to legal rights and responsibilities. The lawyer who'd handled her divorce had talked about custody arrangements and child support. But nobody had asked what Carrie herself wanted. "I want to keep my baby," she said quietly. "I want to raise them here, or somewhere far from Seattle. I want to be a mother and build a life that has nothing to do with Marcus Thornton or his empire or his new girlfriend." "Then that's what you'll do," Danny said. "It's not that simple. Marcus has resources, lawyers, money. If he decides to fight for custody—" "Let him try," Danny said, and there was something in his voice that made Carrie look at him more closely. Her brother had always been quiet, content to stay in Montana while she went off to pursue a bigger life. But there was a sharpness in his eyes now, a calculated intelligence that she'd never noticed before. "Danny, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Marcus Thornton is a bully who needs to learn that some people can't be bullied." Danny said. He looked at their father. "Dad, is the Wellington offer still on the table?" Robert nodded slowly. "It is. They want to sell their controlling interest before the end of the quarter." Then let's buy it and start with phase two. Carrie looked between her father and brother, confused. What's phase two? What are you talking about? Danny smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a chess player who'd just seen checkmate 6 moves away. Do you remember when I did my MBA at Harvard? Danny asked. Of course, you came home after 2 years and never left. I came home because Dad needed help managing the family investments. The ranch is nice, Carrie, but it's not where our money comes from. We have controlling interests in 17 different companies. We own timberland from here to Oregon. We've got a private equity fund that's outperformed Berkshire Hathaway for the last decade. Carrie stared at him. What? The retired teacher thing is Dad's cover. Danny continued. He likes his privacy, and I like mine, but that doesn't mean we're not paying attention to what happens in the world. Robert took over. When you started dating Marcus, I had him investigated. Standard practice for anyone getting close to my daughter. He was ambitious, talented, and ruthlessly self-interested. But you loved him, so I kept my concerns to myself. You investigated him. Carrie felt like the ground was tilting beneath her. And I've been tracking Apex Innovations since the day he started it. Danny added, with your $50,000, by the way, which I told Dad not to give him, but you were in love, so Helen put her hand over Carrie's. We let you make your own choices, sweetheart, even when we disagreed with them. But now that he's hurt you, now we protect you. How? Danny pulled out his phone and showed her a spreadsheet. It meant nothing to Carrie, just numbers and percentages and company names she didn't recognize. This, Danny said, is Apex Innovations stock ownership breakdown. Marcus owns 23% personally. Various venture capital firms own another 40%. The remaining 37% is publicly traded. Or it was, until about 3 weeks ago. What happened 3 weeks ago? I started buying it through shell corporations, private equity funds, offshore accounts. It's amazing what you can do when you have money and patience. Carrie's heart was pounding. How much have you bought? As of this morning, 31.4%. By the end of next week, I'll have controlling interest. And then Marcus Thornton is going to learn what it feels like to be someone's first draft. Marcus Thornton had never experienced real fear before. Anxiety, sure, the nervousness of a big presentation or a tough negotiation. But not fear, not the cold, creeping sensation that something was going wrong and he couldn't control it. It started small. A key supplier suddenly invoking a force majeure clause, tripling their prices overnight. A software engineer accepting a position at a competitor despite Marcus offering him a 20% raise to stay. Little cracks in the foundation of his empire. Preston Wells was in Marcus's office twice a day now, bringing increasingly concerning reports. Someone's buying our debt, Preston said one Tuesday morning. The loans we took out for the product development, they've been sold to a private equity firm called North Star Holdings. So loans get sold all the time. North Star is demanding immediate compliance audits. They're within their rights. But the timing is suspicious. Marcus rubbed his temples. Fine, give them the audits. We have nothing to hide. There's more. The stock acquisition I mentioned last month, it's accelerated. Someone now owns over 30% of our publicly traded shares. Who? I don't know. It's hidden behind layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Whoever's doing this is sophisticated and well-funded. Marcus thought about his enemies. Victor Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, hated him. But Sterling's company was struggling. He didn't have the capital for a hostile takeover. There were a few venture capitalists who'd lost money betting against Apex in the early days, but none with the resources to pull off something this complex. Keep digging, Marcus said. Find out who's behind this. Meanwhile, his personal life was everything he'd wanted. Vivian had transformed the penthouse into an Instagram-worthy showcase of modern luxury. They were invited to every important event. Tech Innovator magazine had put them on the cover with the headline, "The Power Couple Redefining Success." Vivian's follower count had jumped to 700,000, but she was starting to get on his nerves. Marcus, we need to talk about the wedding, Vivian said one evening as they got ready for a charity gala. She was wearing a red dress that cost $8,000 and made her look like a supermodel. Marcus was in his third Tom Ford tux. What about it? I'm thinking Aspen in December. Very European ski lodge aesthetic. We could get married on the mountain at sunset, then have the reception at the St. Regis. Doesn't that sound amazing? Sure, yeah, whatever you want. Vivian pouted. You're not excited. Marcus, this is our wedding. It's supposed to be the best day of our lives. I'm excited, Bishu. Marcus lied. I've just got a lot on my mind with work. The truth was, he wasn't sure about marrying Vivian anymore. She was beautiful and fun and great for his image, but there was something hollow about her. She never read books. She had opinions about restaurants and fashion, but nothing substantial about the world. Her conversation topics were limited to social media trends and celebrity gossip. He found himself thinking about Carrie sometimes, how she used to read articles about quantum computing and ask him intelligent questions about his work, how she could talk about history or art or philosophy with genuine passion, how she never needed to be the center of attention. But Carrie was gone. She'd signed the divorce papers without fighting, taken her $2 million, and disappeared. His lawyer had reported that she'd moved to Montana, to her family's ranch. Marcus pictured her in some dusty farmhouse, probably working as a librarian or teacher, living the small, boring life she'd been destined for all along. He'd made the right choice. He'd upgraded. This weird paranoia about the business was probably just stress from the rapid growth. Everything was fine. Everything was fine. He kept telling himself that even as Preston Wells hired 3 different forensic accountants to track down North Star Holdings, and even as his head of engineering reported that 2 more senior developers had resigned, and even as a mysterious audit request arrived from the SEC. Marcus, Preston said one Friday afternoon, his voice tight with stress. I need to call an emergency board meeting. Why? Because as of 1 hour ago, North Star Holdings owns 51.2% of Apex Innovations. They have controlling interest, and they're exercising their right to restructure leadership. Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. What does that mean? Preston looked like he might be sick. It means you're about to be fired from your own company. Carrie knew she had to tell Marcus about the pregnancy. Grace had flown to Montana for the weekend specifically to have this conversation with her. You're 12 weeks now, Grace said as they walked through the Brennan property. You're showing, soon everyone will know. It's better if he hears it from you first. Why? So he can claim it's not his, so he can drag me through the courts. So you can say you did the right thing, Grace said gently. Look, Marcus is a piece of work, but that baby deserves a chance to know their father, even if their father is an idiot. And you deserve to look your child in the eye someday and say you tried. Carrie knew Grace was right, but the thought of seeing Marcus again made her physically ill. Still, she made the call. His assistant was surprised to hear from her, but Marcus agreed to meet. Coffee shop, public place. 1 hour. He looked different when he walked in, thinner, with shadows under his eyes. His suit was still impeccable, but there was a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there before. Carrie, he said, sliding into the booth across from her. I'm surprised you wanted to meet. I thought you were done with Seattle. I am. I'm just here for the day. She took a breath. I have something to tell you. He waited, and she saw the old Marcus for a moment, the one who'd listened to her ideas and valued her opinions. Then the mask slipped back into place. I'm pregnant. 12 weeks. It's yours. I'm keeping it. The silence stretched between them. Marcus's expression went through several rapid changes: shock, calculation, suspicion, and finally cold assessment. How convenient, he said finally. Perfect timing, really, right after a generous divorce settlement. Carrie felt like he'd slapped her. You think I planned this? I think you're smart enough to know that a baby changes the financial equation. Child support from a billionaire. That's worth a lot more than $2 million. I don't want your money. Marcus, right. That's why you're telling me now, after the divorce is final, when you can claim maximum child support. He leaned back, his expression hard. My lawyer will be in touch. We'll need a paternity test, obviously, and I'll be filing for full custody. What? Carrie's voice came out as a whisper. You're unemployed, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Montana. I can provide a better life for this child. Private schools, resources, opportunities. What can you offer a ranch in the middle of nowhere? You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. And Carrie, Vivian, and I are getting married in December. She's excited about being a stepmother. She's already started designing a nursery for the penthouse. Carrie felt bile rise in her throat. You are not taking my baby. We'll see what the court says. Marcus stood up. My lawyer will contact you about the paternity test. Have a safe flight back to Montana. He walked out, leaving Carrie shaking in the booth. Grace found her 20 minutes later, still sitting there in shock. What happened? He's going to try to take the baby. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare. Marcus's lawyer sent her aggressive letters demanding paternity tests and temporary custody arrangements. The letters mentioned her unstable living situation and lack of resources. They suggested it would be in the child's best interest to be raised by Marcus and Vivian in Seattle, with generous visitation rights for Carrie. Then came the media leak. Somehow, the tabloids found out about the pregnancy. The headlines were vicious. First draft baby ex-wife's last attempt to cash in. Tech CEO fights for unborn child against unstable ex. Vivian Cross ready to be super stepmom to rival's baby. Carrie stopped reading after the first 3 articles. She was 16 weeks pregnant now, visibly showing, and the stress was affecting her health. Her blood pressure was elevated. She wasn't sleeping. Grace was worried enough to call her every night. Then came the worst day. Carrie woke up at 3 in the morning with blinding pain. Her vision was blurry. Her hands and feet were swollen. She barely made it to the phone to call 911 before she collapsed. Preeclampsia, dangerous for both her and the baby. They admitted her to the hospital in Bozeman, putting her on magnesium sulfate and monitoring the baby's heartbeat constantly. She was alone in the hospital room when Marcus's lawyer called. Ms. Brennan, I'm filing an emergency motion with the court. Given your current medical crisis and unstable condition, we believe the child would be better served by being born under Mr. Thornton's care in Seattle. We're requesting immediate transfer of medical decisions to the father. You can't do that. The baby's not even born yet. We'll see what the judge says. I'll be in touch. Carrie hung up and started to cry. Deep shaking sobs that made the nurses rush in. This couldn't be happening. Marcus was going to take her baby. He had the money, the lawyers, the resources. What did she have? A hospital bed in Montana and a medical crisis that his lawyers would use to paint her as unfit. Grace arrived that evening, bringing magazines and snacks that Carrie couldn't eat, but she also brought news from Seattle. The social media reaction is turning, Grace said. People are calling Marcus a monster. There's a hashtag called #SaveFirstDraft, and it's trending. People are organizing protests outside Apex Innovations. It doesn't matter, Carrie said. Public opinion doesn't win custody cases. Money does, and he has all of it. The next morning, Carrie woke to find she wasn't alone. Her parents were there, sitting in the uncomfortable hospital chairs. They looked older than she remembered, and there was something in her father's expression that scared her. Mom, Dad, how did you know I was here? Danny called us, Helen said, taking her hand. We came as fast as we could. I'm fine, the baby's fine. They're just keeping me for observation. Caroline, Robert said, and his voice was gentle but firm. We need to talk about Marcus. While Carrie was fighting for her baby in a Montana hospital, her brother Danny was waging a very different war in Seattle. He'd arrived in the city 3 weeks earlier, checking into a modest hotel under an assumed name. Danny had learned from his father that the key to success was invisibility. Let people underestimate you. Let them think you're harmless. Then strike when they're not looking. His first stop was a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, where he met Jake Murphy. They'd been roommates at Harvard Business School, and Jake had gone on to become one of the best forensic tech analysts in the country. Let me get this straight, Jake said, stirring his third espresso. You want me to analyze the code base of Apex Innovations and find vulnerabilities. Not just vulnerabilities. Danny said, no. I want to know if Marcus Thornton actually wrote the code he claims is his revolutionary innovation. Jake grinned. You think he stole it? I know he did. I just need you to prove it. It took Jake 4 days. He came back with a 40-page report that made Danny smile for the first time since Carrie had called him crying. Marcus's flagship product, the Apex integration platform, is 93% identical to a doctoral dissertation written by a guy named Jeffrey Wallace at MIT in 2015. Jake said, Wallace died in a car accident in 2016. Marcus worked with him briefly as a consultant. He just took the dead guy's work and claimed it as his own. Can you prove it? In court. Absolutely, this is intellectual property theft at a massive scale. If it comes out, Apex Innovations will be looking at lawsuits, SEC investigations, and potential criminal charges. Danny filed the information away. It was ammunition, but not the kind he needed yet. First, he needed to take the company itself. North Star Holdings wasn't a real company in the traditional sense. It was a network of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and private equity funds that all ultimately traced back to Brennan family wealth. Danny had spent 2 years building this structure specifically for acquisitions that needed to stay anonymous. Over 4 weeks, North Star quietly bought every available share of Apex Innovation stock. Danny used algorithms to make small purchases across hundreds of accounts, never buying enough at once to trigger disclosure requirements. He also bought up the company's debt from various lenders, giving him additional leverage. By the time Marcus's CFO Preston Wells noticed what was happening, Danny already owned controlling interest. Now came the hard part, destroying Marcus's peace of mind before delivering the final blow. Danny started with the suppliers. Apex relied on a semiconductor manufacturer in Taiwan for their core hardware components. Danny's family owned 17% of that manufacturer through a holding company. One phone call, and suddenly Apex was facing unexpected supply chain issues that tripled their costs. Next came the talent drain. Danny had Jake identify the top 15 engineers at Apex Innovations, the people who actually understood how the technology worked. Then he made them offers they couldn't refuse. Not just higher salaries, but equity positions in competing firms, better benefits, and relocation packages. 5 of them accepted within a week. Then came the SEC audit. Danny had friends at the Securities and Exchange Commission, people who'd gone to Harvard with him and now worked in enforcement. He provided them with enough questionable financial transactions to justify a formal investigation into Apex's accounting practices. Nothing illegal, just enough smoke to make investors nervous. The effect on Marcus was exactly what Danny wanted. He watched from afar as the CEO became increasingly paranoid and erratic. Stock analysts downgraded Apex from buy to hold. Tech blogs started questioning whether Marcus Thornton was losing his touch. Vivian's Instagram posts became less frequent as she realized her gravy train might be derailing. But Danny's real masterstroke was the board meeting. Corporate bylaws required that shareholders with controlling interest could call an emergency meeting and vote on leadership changes. Danny had North Star Holdings exercise that right on a Thursday afternoon, giving Marcus exactly 72 hours notice as required by law. Marcus wouldn't know who was behind it until the meeting itself. That was the beauty of the Shell Corporation structure. He'd be sitting in his own boardroom, wondering who'd bought his company, right up until the moment Danny walked through the door. Back in Montana, Carrie was discharged from the hospital after 3 days of monitoring. Her blood pressure had stabilized, and the baby was doing well. But the stress of the custody threat was still hanging over her. That's when Robert and Helen told her the truth about the family's wealth and Danny's plan. "Your brother has been planning this since the night you called him," Robert said. "He's not just buying stock, Caroline. He's taking Marcus's entire company away from him." "He can't do that," Carrie whispered. "He can, and he is," Helen said. By tomorrow afternoon, Danny will own Apex Innovations, and Marcus Thornton will be voted out as CEO. "But why? I just want him to leave me and the baby alone. I don't want revenge." "This isn't just revenge," Robert said. "It's protection. Marcus threatened to take your child. He has the resources to fight you in court for years, draining you emotionally and financially. But if he has no company, no income, and no reputation, he can't fight anyone." The next morning, Carrie got another call from Marcus's lawyer, but this time the tone was different. "Ms. Brennan, we need to discuss the terms of Mr. Thornton's parental rights. We're willing to negotiate a reasonable custody arrangement that won't require court intervention." "What changed?" A long pause. "Let's just say Mr. Thornton's circumstances have evolved. We'll be in touch." Carrie hung up and looked at her parents. "What did Danny do, Capone?" "Come to Seattle tomorrow," Robert said. "You'll want to see this." The Apex Innovations headquarters occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Seattle. Marcus had picked the building specifically because you could see the Space Needle from the top floor conference room. He liked the symbolism of looking down on the city that had once ignored him. Now that conference room was filled with his board of directors, and Marcus felt like he was facing a firing squad. Preston Wells wouldn't make eye contact. The other board members, venture capitalists who'd been enthusiastic supporters just months ago, looked uncomfortable. Only Victor Sterling, his old rival, seemed pleased, which made Marcus even more nervous. "What's this about?" Marcus demanded. "Who called this meeting Fletcher Grayson?" A lawyer Marcus had never seen before stood at the head of the table. He was 60-something, gray-haired, and had the kind of expensive calm that came from representing people who never worried about money. "Mr. Thornton, I'm Fletcher Grayson, representing North Star Holdings. As you may be aware, North Star has acquired 51.2% of Apex Innovations voting shares. We've called this meeting to discuss restructuring of leadership." "You can't do this. I founded this company." "And we respect that," Fletcher said smoothly. "But ownership and management are separate issues. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, and North Star, as majority shareholder, has expressed concerns about current leadership." "Who's North Star? Who's behind this? All will be revealed shortly. First, we need to vote on the motion to remove you as Chief Executive Officer." Marcus looked around the table desperately. These were people he'd made wealthy, people he'd mentored and supported. But one by one, they raised their hands in favor of his removal. Even Preston Wells, his supposed friend, voted yes. "This is a coup," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I'll sue. I'll fight this." "You're welcome to try," Fletcher said. "But I should inform you that North Star also purchased your company's outstanding debt. If you pursue litigation, we'll be forced to call those loans immediately. Given your personal guarantee on several of them, that would result in bankruptcy. Is that really the path you want to take?" Marcus felt like the walls were closing in. "Who are you people?" The conference room door opened. A man walked in wearing jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots that looked like they'd seen actual work. He carried a gas station coffee cup and had the relaxed confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. It took Marcus a moment to place him. The ranch in Montana, Carrie's brother, the quiet one who barely spoke at family dinners. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked. Danny Brennan smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Hello, Marcus. Nice office. Great view. I don't understand. I'm North Star Holdings. Well, my family is. We've been acquiring your company for the past month. As of yesterday, we own it, and the board just voted you out as CEO." Marcus's brain couldn't process what he was hearing. You're a rancher. You live in Montana. You're nobody. Is that what you thought?" Danny pulled out a chair and sat down, completely at ease. "Let me clear up some misconceptions. My family's been in Montana since 1873. We made our money in timber, then diversified into railroads, mining, and private equity. I have an MBA from Harvard. I manage a portfolio worth about $800 million. And my sister, the woman you called your first draft, she's a Brennan, which means she's family. And we protect our family." The color drained from Marcus's face. "No, this isn't possible." "It's already done. You're out. I'm in. Apex Innovations will continue operating, but under new management. Your employment contract has been terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building within the hour." "You can't do this." "I just did." Danny took a sip of his coffee. "Oh, and Marcus, about that custody fight you were planning, I'd reconsider. You're unemployed now. Your assets are pledged against loans that we own. Your reputation in this industry is about to become very complicated. So maybe, instead of fighting Carrie for custody, you should be grateful she's willing to let you have any relationship with your child at all." Marcus tried to respond, but his chest felt tight. The room was spinning. He grabbed the edge of the table, trying to stay upright, but his vision was tunneling, darkening at the edges. "Someone call an ambulance," Fletcher Grayson said calmly. "I believe Mr. Thornton is having a panic attack." The last thing Marcus heard before he collapsed was Danny's voice, quiet and almost sympathetic. "You should have been kinder to my sister, Marcus, but some people have to learn the hard way." Marcus woke up in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm and a heart monitor beeping steadily beside him. For a blissful moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. Then memory came flooding back, and he groaned. "Ah, you're awake." A nurse checked his vitals with professional efficiency. You had a severe panic attack. Your blood pressure spiked dangerously high. The doctor wants to keep you overnight for observation. What hospital is this? Swedish Medical Center. You're lucky. Really? Panic attacks can feel like heart attacks, but there's no permanent damage. Physical damage. Maybe. But everything else was destroyed. Marcus asked for his phone. The nurse handed it over reluctantly, warning him about stress levels. He had 63 missed calls and over 200 texts. Most were from reporters. Tech news sites were already running the story. Apex Innovations osts founder in surprise board vote. Marcus Thornton removed as CEO after mysterious takeover. Who is Daniel Brennan, Montana investor, takes control of Seattle tech firm. The articles were brutal. They detailed his public divorce from Carrie, his affair with Vivian Sejam, and now his dramatic fall from grace. Some reporters had already connected the dots. Sources say Brennan is the brother of Thornton's ex-wife, Caroline Brennan, whom Thornton famously divorced during a public gala in September. His phone rang. Vivian. Marcus, what's happening? Twitter is saying you got fired. It's true, Tim. But how? It's your company. Not anymore. His voice sounded dead even to himself. A long pause. So what does this mean for us? What do you think it means? Vivian, I need to think about my brand. This isn't great optics for me. Being associated with a failed CEO. Your brand, Marcus repeated. Don't be like that. You understand business. This is complicated. I think maybe we should postpone the wedding, just until things settle down. Sure, yeah, postpone it. He hung up before she could say anything else. Over the next week, Marcus's life unraveled completely. Vivian officially took a break from their relationship, which meant she moved out of the penthouse and was photographed having dinner with a venture capitalist from Sand Hill Road within 3 days. His friends stopped returning calls. Preston Wells issued a statement praising the new direction under Danny Brennan's leadership. The magazine that was going to feature Marcus and Vivian on their cover killed the story. Marcus's personal assets were pledged against company loans, which North Star Holdings now owned. His lawyers advised immediate bankruptcy filing. He had to sell the penthouse, the Tesla, the vacation home in Lake Tahoe, everything. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Bellevue that cost $2,000 a month and felt like a prison cell compared to what he'd lost. But the worst part was the silence. For years, Marcus had been someone important. People wanted his time, his attention, his approval. Now he was nobody. His calls went to voicemail. His emails got automated responses. The tech community that had once celebrated him now treated him like a cautionary tale. One night, drunk on cheap whiskey in his depressing apartment, Marcus called Carrie. She answered on the third ring. What do you want? Marcus, I'm sorry. The words came out slurred. I'm so sorry for everything. The gala, the divorce, trying to take the baby. I was an idiot. You're drunk. Yeah, but I'm also sorry. You deserve better. I know. Her voice was calm, detached. Is that all? Your brother destroyed me. No, Marcus, you destroyed yourself. Danny just made you face consequences. Will you ever forgive me? A long silence. Maybe, someday, but not today. And not because you're drunk and lonely. If you want forgiveness, you earn it. You become the man you should have been all along. She hung up. Marcus sat in his empty apartment, looking at the bottle of whiskey, and realized something. He'd been measuring his worth in all the wrong ways. Money, status, power. They'd felt so important. Now they were gone, and he was still here, still breathing, still capable of making different choices. It was a small realization, but it was a start. 6 months later, Carrie gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him James Robert Brennan, after her father and grandfather. Marcus wasn't at the hospital. He'd signed away his parental rights as part of the settlement with North Star Holdings, though Danny had structured it so Marcus could petition to restore them after 3 years of demonstrating stability and responsibility. It was more mercy than Marcus deserved, but Carrie had agreed to it, not for Marcus's sake, but for James. Every child deserved a chance to know their father, even if that father had been a disaster. Life in Montana was peaceful. Carrie lived in a renovated guest house on her parents' property, a comfortable space with room for a nursery and a home office. She'd started a nonprofit organization called the First Draft Foundation, helping divorced women rebuild their lives and careers. The name was a gentle reclamation of the insult Marcus had thrown at her. Danny had stepped down as CEO of Apex Innovations after restructuring the company and installing ethical leadership. The company was thriving under new management, and Danny had returned to Montana, content to manage the family investments from his home office. Everything seemed perfect. Then Victor Sterling made his move. Sterling Dynamics had been struggling for years, unable to compete with more innovative firms. Victor Sterling himself was known in the tech industry as a ruthless operator who'd built his empire on corporate espionage, stolen patents, and predatory business practices. He'd watched Marcus Thornton's fall with interest, and he'd noticed something that Danny Brennan hadn't fully covered: a few questionable financial transactions from Apex's early days that could be interpreted, with the right spin, as securities fraud. Sterling fed fabricated evidence to the SEC and several business journalists. Within a week, federal investigators were looking into Apex Innovations, specifically into potential fraud during the period when Danny Brennan had been CEO. The charges were baseless, but that didn't matter. The investigation itself was enough to tank the company's stock. Partners started pulling out. Employees got nervous. And most importantly, Brennan Holdings' entire portfolio was now under scrutiny. If Danny went down, the family fortune went with him. And Carrie, still recovering from giving birth and trying to launch her nonprofit, would lose everything. Grace delivered the news when she came to visit James. "It's all over the news," Grace said, showing Carrie her phone. "Federal investigation into Apex Innovations. They're saying there was securities fraud, insider trading. Carrie, this could destroy your family." "But Danny didn't do anything wrong. He bought the company legally." "Doesn't matter. Sterling's planted enough evidence to make it look suspicious. And in this climate, with all the tech scandals, the feds are going to investigate thoroughly. It could take years to clear Danny's name, and by then the damage will be done." Carrie looked at her sleeping son and felt a familiar cold dread settle over her, just when she thought she'd found stability, when she thought the nightmare was over. Here came another threat. "What can we do?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "But you need someone who understands how Sterling operates. Someone who's fought him before." They both knew who that was. Marcus Thornton had rebuilt a small, quiet life in Seattle. He worked as a senior developer at a mid-sized tech firm, making a fraction of what he used to earn, but doing honest work. He'd been in therapy for 6 months, dealing with his narcissism and learning to value things beyond status and power. He'd sent Carrie a check every month for child support, even though she'd never asked for it and legally didn't have to accept it. She'd deposited each one into a savings account for James. When Carrie called him, Marcus answered immediately. "It's me," Carrie said. "I need your help." "Anything." She explained the situation. Sterling, the investigation, the threat to her family. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "Sterling's been trying to destroy me for years. He's the one who leaked the story about Vivian and me to the tabloids. He wants to be the last man standing in Seattle tech. Can you stop him?" "Maybe, if I testify about his business practices. If I give the feds evidence of his own securities violations. I've kept records for years, just in case. But Carrie, it means going public, putting myself back in the spotlight. I've been trying to stay invisible." "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." "I know, and I owe you everything, so yeah, I'll help." The next week, Marcus walked into a federal building in downtown Seattle with a lawyer and 3 file boxes of evidence. He spent 8 hours explaining Victor Sterling's history of corporate crimes, backed up by emails, financial records, and recorded phone conversations. The investigation into Apex Innovations quietly disappeared. A new investigation into Sterling Dynamics began. Victor Sterling was arrested 3 months later on multiple counts of securities fraud, corporate espionage, and racketeering. His company collapsed. His reputation was destroyed, and Marcus Thornton, who could have stayed silent and safe, had risked everything to protect the family of the woman he'd once discarded as his first draft. 1 year after James Robert Brennan was born, Carrie hosted a small birthday party at the Montana ranch. It wasn't a big affair, just family and close friends. Grace flew in from Seattle. Danny was there, of course, along with their parents. A few neighbors from nearby ranches brought their kids. The sun was setting over the mountains. painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. James was taking his first wobbly steps across the grass, laughing every time he fell down. He had Carrie's dark hair and Marcus's blue eyes, though Carrie tried not to think about that too much. Grace was helping Helen set up the dessert table when she nudged Carrie. "Someone's at the gate." A truck was coming up the long driveway, kicking up dust. It stopped near the house, and a man got out. He was thinner than Carrie remembered, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He carried a small wrapped gift and looked terrified. Marcus. Carrie had sent the invitation 3 weeks ago. She hadn't expected him to actually come. He walked over slowly like he was approaching something fragile that might break. "Hi. Hi." Carrie looked at her son, who was now attempting to eat grass. "You came. You invited me. I wasn't sure if you meant it, but I couldn't not try." He held out the gift. "For James, it's a book. Just a kid's book about Montana." I saw it and thought, well, I don't know what I thought. Danny appeared at Carrie's shoulder, protective as always. "Marcus?" "Danny, sir." Marcus looked genuinely nervous. "Thank you for letting me come." "I didn't let you. Carrie invited you. This is her call." There was an awkward silence. Then James noticed the new person and toddled over, curious. He grabbed Marcus's leg to steady himself and looked up with those bright blue eyes. Marcus froze. He looked at Carrie, asking permission. "You can pick him up," she said quietly. Marcus bent down and carefully, so carefully, lifted his son. James immediately grabbed his nose and laughed. And Marcus, the man who'd once held her in front of 500 people and called her his first draft, started to cry. "He's perfect," Marcus whispered. "Carrie, he's perfect." "I know." They stood there for a moment, the three of them. Not quite a family, but not quite strangers either. Something in between, something undefined. "I don't expect anything," Marcus said, wiping his eyes with one hand while holding James with the other. "I know I gave up my rights. I just wanted to see him, to know he's okay, to say thank you for letting him exist and be this beautiful kid." "You can visit," Carrie said. "Not often, not without supervision for a while. But you can visit. If you keep doing the work. If you keep being the person you're trying to become instead of the person you were." "I will, I promise." Danny cleared his throat. "Dinner's ready. You're welcome to stay, Marcus. But first, you and I need to talk." The two men walked off toward the barn, leaving Carrie with James. Grace came over and put an arm around her shoulders. "You okay?" "I think so. It's weird. A year ago, I wanted to destroy him. Now I just want him to be better. For James's sake." "That's growth," Grace said. "For both of you." The party went on as the sun set. Marcus stayed for dinner, sitting at the far end of the table, mostly listening. He was quiet, respectful, careful not to overstep. When James started to fuss, Marcus asked permission before helping, and when Carrie said she'd handle it, he backed off immediately. It was the opposite of the arrogant man who'd once tried to take her child away. As people started to leave, Marcus found Carrie on the porch. James was asleep in her arms. "Thank you for today," Marcus said. "I know I don't deserve this." "You don't," Carrie agreed. "But James deserves a chance to know his father, and maybe you deserve a chance to be the man you should have been all along." "I'm trying. I'm in therapy twice a week. I have a sponsor who keeps me accountable. I'm working on myself." "Good. Keep doing that." "Carrie, I need to say this. What I did to you at that gala, calling you my first draft, it was the cruelest thing I've ever done. And the stupidest. You were never a first draft. You were the finished version, and I was too arrogant to see it. You were the only person who ever believed in me for who I was, not what I could do for them. And I threw that away for shallow things that don't matter. I threw away the best thing in my life." Carrie looked at him for a long moment. "I forgive you, Marcus. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. And holding on to anger isn't peace." "Ooh, can I ask you something? Do you think there's any chance, maybe in the future?" "No," she said firmly but not unkindly. "We're not getting back together. Ever. That part of our story is over. But we can write a new story. One where you're a good father to James, one where we're respectful co-parents. That's all I can offer." Marcus nodded. and there was something like relief in his expression. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. He left as the stars came out, driving back down the long driveway toward whatever life he was building in Seattle. Danny came to stand beside Carrie on the porch. Think he'll actually change? I don't know, Carrie said, but I think he's trying. And that's something. You're being very generous. I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it for James. And for me, Benam, I spent too long being angry and hurt. I want to be something else now. What's that, happy? She smiled. Just happy. Inside the house, the family was cleaning up from the party. Helen was washing dishes while Robert wrapped leftover cake. Grace was taking pictures of the decorations to remember the day. It was domestic and normal and beautiful. This was the life Carrie had built from the ashes of her public humiliation. Not a life of revenge or bitterness, but one of purpose and family and quiet strength. She'd been called a first draft once, by a man too blind to see her value. But she'd learned something important in the year since there are no rough drafts when it comes to human beings. Everyone is complete, whole, and valuable exactly as they are. Some people just take longer to realize it than others. Carrie looked down at her sleeping son and whispered, "You're going to grow up knowing you're enough, exactly as you are, no matter what anyone else says." And as the Montana stars glittered overhead, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: peace.